Hello, we are continuing our study of Galatians, and I'm doing something today. I really wanted to talk more about a verse that I kind of neglected. All of these verses, we could say a whole lot more about these verses than we've said, obviously. But anyway, one thing um, that I did is I didn't say as much as I wanted to say about a verse that we're going to talk about today. And that is Galatians chapter 5, verse 26. Now, next Lord's Day, God willing, I'll start with verse 6 and go through a few more verses. But I want to back up, even though we studied down to verse 6 in our last two studies, I want to back up and look at one verse, just the very last verse of Galatians chapter 5. And it's a very simple verse. Paul says, let us not become conceited, provoking and envying each other. So I want to talk about, because really we talked about how we show true spirituality in the last lessons. And before this verse, and that's after this verse, and before this verse, we talked about how to be fruitful as a believer as well. And so, but I want to talk about this verse because it really points back and forwards to what we just, the verses in front of it and the verses behind it that we've studied. And I want to look and just consider a few things about what Paul says in this passage and how he's really talking practically in this section of Galatians chapters 5 and 6. We've said that in the past. But I want to talk about how that the gospel, the good news about Jesus Christ, how that it affects the way that we look at ourselves and how that it affects the way that we look at people around us. And I think that's what Paul is addressing here. And so there's some very practical principles in this passage, I think, even alone, that deal with our relation with other people. So what we're going to see today is the good news about Jesus Christ. What it does is it creates a whole new self-image. And this self-image isn't based upon comparisons with other people. That's what we're going to see in this passage, I think, today. And so only the gospel is going to give us confidence, we're going to see. We're not going to disdain other people, despise other people. And we're going to see, we're going to have boldness because of the gospel. And we're also going to be humble because of the gospel. We're not going to compare ourselves, we're going to see. And this is what we're going to see in this passage. You compare yourselves, a lot of people do when they don't have the gospel, with people who they think are above them or people who they think are below them. But what we do with the gospel, when you have the gospel and we live by the gospel, as he talked about in Galatians chapter 2, what you do is you look at your responsibility and you look at your offer of gratitude and service for what Christ has done for us. And so we are going to look at this verse, simple verse. Paul says, let us not become conceited, provoking and envying one another. Now, he's just encouraged, you recall in chapter 5, for us. In fact, the very previous verse, he says, keep in step with the Spirit. So walk in step with the Spirit. And this walking in step with the Spirit is really an internal daily crucifixion, a daily preaching to yourselves the good news about Jesus Christ. And we're going to see that that's what he's just said after he talked about the fruit of the Spirit. That's the way we're going to grow our character, which is the fruit of the Spirit. So Paul now, of course, wants to show us we keep in step with the Spirit by not being conceited and not provoking and not envying other people. So what does this word conceit mean? Well, the word conceit, literally, if we were to translate this word, from the original language to English, it means vainglory. Literally, he's saying, don't be vainglorious, or another way of saying vain is empty. So to be conceited is to be empty of honor. Conceit is a deep insecurity. It's a perceived absence of honor, of glory. It's leading people to prove that they're worth to other people, you might say. And so what happens when you're conceited is you fix your mind upon other people. You start comparing yourselves with other people. Now, Paul said something in 2 Corinthians. He said, to compare yourselves with other people is not wise. And we're going to see that here today. It's not wise to compare yourselves with people you think are better than yourself, or it's not wise to compare yourself with people you think you're better than them. And so conceit, someone who is empty of honor, they become, in one way, you could say, very competitive. And this is really our state without the good news of the gospel. We are conceited. And when we're conceited, we're going to, Paul says, do these two things right here. We're going to provoke and we're going to envy each other. Now, the word provoke, it has to do with being competitive, as I said. And it means to challenge someone literally to a contest. It's feeling superior. You want people to, you're always comparing yourself with people you think are below you. And you want people to feel that you are superior to them. And then to envy, you feel like you're inferior and you want what other people have. It's a feeling of inferiority. And sometimes it can even mean you don't want other people to have what they have. You don't have it, but you don't want them to have it either. And so what Paul is teaching here is this comes from being conceited. Both of these, provoking other people, envying other people, is because you're self-absorbed. And you need to take your eyes off other people in this way, feeling superior or inferior about anything. And you need to be reminded of the gospel. We're going to talk about that, the good news message, because you're going to focus upon something else. And when you are a true believer, and you're not going to feel like you're superior to people in any way, and you're not going to feel like you're inferior to people in any way when you understand the gospel. And so that's the way that's what Paul is teaching here. We need to, Paul has been talking about the good news message about Christ is all about grace. But there were people coming into into this Galatia area, and they were teaching the way you get right with God is through works. And Paul is going to say, no, you need to live in line with the gospel. Don't retreat back to living by works. So again, provoking people and envying people, it's another way of being superior, feeling superior to people or feeling inferior to people. And you're trying to feel superior by competition at the expense of other people, and or you're envious and you wish you had what they had or they didn't have it. And so that's what Paul is talking about here. So the only difference between a person who's arrogant and a person who has low self-esteem is that an inferior person feels like they've lost the game, and a person who feels superior, they feel like they've won the game. You see, they feel like they've won and they're beating someone else. Person who's inferior feels like they lost the game and they're mad because they lost the game, you might say. And so when you're not living by the gospel, the good news about Christ, what Paul is saying is you're spending your time basically feeling superior or inferior to other people. That's the way you look at other people. And so you might think that these are opposites, but they're not. Humility we should have instead of envy, feeling inferior. Humility is not thinking less of you, not thinking less of yourself. That's inferiority. It's thinking of yourself less. It's not, a lot of people think, well, if I think less of myself, that's good news humility. No, it's not. That's just a feeling of the world. It's just as much a rejection of the gospel as pride is and self-confidence is. And so this superiority complex or this inferiority complex, that's the root of, conceit. And it's either born in, and both of them you could say are born in insecurity, as I said there, under the definition of conceit. They're both born in insecurity. They're both born. I got that definition from a book, and I think it's really good. Conceit is a deep insecurity, a perceived absence of honor and glory, leading to a need to prove our worth to others. You see, that's what conceit is. And you can either have conceit and be, as I said, superior, feel superior, or you can have conceit and feel inferior. And so here are some questions that, and as I said, in both instances, conceit is focusing on how another person makes you look and feel instead of how you make them look or feel. So you're all concerned about yourself, aren't you, when you're conceited? And so here are some questions to ask whether or not you're conceited. Do I have a tendency to blow up or to clam up? A lot of people just blow up. Of course, they feel superior. Or do I clam up? People think, well, that's what I ought to do. Well, that's just a feeling of inferiority. Do I pick arguments? You see, if you feel you're superior, that's what you might do. Pick arguments with people. Or do you just completely avoid confrontation? Well, that's what a person they're conceited too, you see. Both of these are conceited. But they think, I'm inferior, just avoid confrontation. Do I get very down on people? Well, that's somebody who's conceited that feels superior. Or do I become intimidated by people around me? Well, that's someone who's feeling inferior. They're conceited too, you see. They're wanting honor, but it's just in a different way. They're honor hungry. Or do I think I would never, ever do what that person has done? You see, that's conceit, but feeling superior. Or I could never, ever accomplish what this person has accomplished. Well, that's conceit. That's a feeling of inferiority. And so the Spirit actually works in us to apply the gospel to us, and we have a whole new self-perception and a whole new view of other people, because God creates a new image. He creates a new person when we obey the gospel, and it's not based upon our comparison with other people. You see, the gospel, only the good news about Jesus Christ, can make us not despise and look down on people and be self-confident, or be envious and want what other people have and be, you might say, self-disdaining. But we can be humble. You see, this works its way out. The gospel works its way into our relationships with other people. The gospel addresses this idea of vainglory. So, and how does it do that? Well, if you've got a feeling of superiority, but you are living and walking and keeping in step with the Spirit, you're living according to the good news message about Christ. What you think, instead of this feeling of superiority, is what I think about me is not important. I'm just as undeserving a sinner as everybody else. You see, we're all in the same boat. You don't look down on other people. You realize, hey, we're all in the same boat. And so you don't have this feeling of conceit, and you provoke other people and think you've won because you realize, wow, that what I think anyway isn't even important about me. And then on the other hand, if you envy other people, that's what people out in the world do. But if you're saved by the gospel and you're living in line with the gospel, you think, well, what you think about me, isn't important either. I have the approval of Jesus Christ himself. He's my righteousness. He's my worth, not what you've done or you've accomplished. It's what Jesus has accomplished. Can you see how that the gospel creates this new self-image? It humbles us, and before everybody, it tells me I'm a sinner. I'm only saved by the grace of God. It also emboldens us. It makes us confident because we know I'm loved. I'm honored. I'm loved and honored by the only eyes in the universe that are worth being honored by: God, my creator, Jesus Christ, my Lord. And so that gives me boldness and that gives me humility at the same time. They can exist together. So, in other words, if you're ever feeling superior to others, you need to preach to yourself the good news about Jesus Christ. If you ever feel inferior to someone, you need to preach to yourself the good news about Jesus Christ. Because either way, here's the way a believer thinks: I'm a son, I'm a daughter of God. And as a son or daughter of God, I can be extremely confident and never despise anybody. You know, a person who is let's say a child of a real king in a real nation, they got a lot of confidence, don't they? Well, we can have tremendous confidence because we are children of the king, and we know that we are. But on the other hand, we're saved how? By grace. And that means we didn't deserve this status, and we're undeserving sinners. It's not because of anything at all that we've done. And so we can always be thankfully humble at the same time of being bold and confident. You see the difference? People outside of Christ, they're constantly concerned about self-honor. I won. I'm better in this respect than someone else. Or, man, I could never do that. I wish I had that. I wish I'd done that. I wish they didn't have that. And the gospel, it defeats both of those mentalities. And so this is a very simple verse, but it's a really good verse, isn't it, about relationships. You start taking your eyes off of yourself in your relation to other people, and you start looking at Christ in your relationship with other people, and it changes everything. So I hope that you've enjoyed Paul's teaching here in this very simple, short little verse tucked in there, right there at the end of Galatians chapter 5, that I rushed over, but I knew I wanted to say something about, and a lot of people might just hardly notice it because of all the other things that he said before, and we emphasize those things and all the things that he says after. But this is a very important little verse that we should all consider as well.